Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional stories that touch the heart. The morning sun had barely risen over the small military base when Sergeant Marcus Webb stepped into his office. With his usual commanding presence, he was a man who believed in order, discipline, and above all, his own authority. For 15 years, he had ruled his unit with an iron fist, and no one dared to question his decisions. His uniform was always perfectly pressed, his boots shined to perfection, and his voice carried the weight of unquestionable power. Sarah Martinez had joined the unit 6 months ago as a communications specialist. She was 24 years old, bright, hardworking, and determined to prove herself in a world that often doubted women in the military. From her first day, she noticed how Sergeant Webb treated the female soldiers differently. His comments were sharp, his criticism excessive, and his expectations impossibly high. While male soldiers received praise for adequate work, women like Sarah were pushed to the breaking point for the same results. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, kept her head down, and hoped that excellence would speak for itself. She arrived earlier than everyone else and stayed later than required. Her reports were flawless, her equipment maintenance impeccable, and her dedication unmatched. But nothing seemed good enough for Sergeant Webb. One Tuesday afternoon, Sarah was working on repairing a critical communication system that had malfunctioned during a training exercise. She had been troubleshooting for hours, barely stopping for water or food. The problem was complex, buried deep within the circuit boards and software interfaces. Other specialists had tried and failed, but Sarah was determined to solve it. Sergeant Webb entered the communications room without knocking, his heavy boots echoing on the concrete floor. He walked straight to Sarah's workstation and stood behind her, arms crossed, watching her work in silence. The air grew tense. Sarah could feel his eyes boring into the back of her head, judging every movement, every decision. After several uncomfortable minutes, he finally spoke. His voice was cold and dismissive. He told her that she was taking too long, that a real soldier would have fixed the problem hours ago. He questioned her training, her competence, and her right to be there. His words were carefully chosen to cut deep without crossing the line into official misconduct. It was a skill he had perfected over the years. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued working, but she refused to respond. She knew that any reaction would give him exactly what he wanted. Instead, she took a slow breath and focused on the circuit board in front of her. 20 minutes later, the system came back online, fully operational. She had succeeded where others had failed, but Sergeant Webb did not acknowledge her achievement. He simply grunted, made a comment about it being her basic duty, and left the room. Sarah sat there for a moment, staring at the repaired equipment, feeling a mix of pride in her work and frustration at the constant dismissal. She wondered how much longer she could endure this treatment. That evening, Sarah sat in the small cafeteria with her friend, Corporal Jamie Chen. Jamie had been in the unit for 2 years and had her own difficult experiences with Sergeant Webb. Over lukewarm coffee and bland dinner trays, the two women shared their stories. Jamie revealed that several other female soldiers had filed informal complaints about Webb's behavior, but nothing ever came of them. The system protected men like him, especially those with long service records and powerful connections. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. She had joined the military to serve her country, to be part of something bigger than herself. Instead, she found herself in a daily battle just to be treated with basic respect. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to support Sarah's education, and her younger sister, who looked up to her as a role model. What would they think if she gave up now? As she lay in her bunk that night, Sarah made a decision. She would not be another silent victim. She would not let Sergeant Webb's toxic behavior define her military career. But she also knew that fighting back directly would be futile. The system was rigged against her. She needed to be smarter, more strategic. She needed evidence, documentation, and a plan. The next morning, Sarah started keeping detailed records of every interaction with Sergeant Webb. She noted dates, times, witnesses, and exact words spoken. She began quietly talking to other female soldiers, learning their stories and encouraging them to document their experiences as well. She researched military regulations, harassment policies, and the proper channels for filing formal complaints. Sergeant Webb, meanwhile, had no idea that the quiet young soldier he had been tormenting was beginning to build a case against him. He continued his pattern of behavior, confident in his untouchable position, unaware that his carefully constructed empire of intimidation was about to face its greatest challenge. Sarah was no longer just surviving. She was preparing for war. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah began documenting everything. Her notebook had become her most valuable possession, hidden carefully in her locker, filled with dates, incidents, and witness names. Every morning she would review her entries, making sure nothing was forgotten, ensuring every detail was accurate. The weight of what she was building grew heavier with each page, but so did her determination. During this time, Sergeant Webb's behavior toward Sarah had intensified. It was as if he sensed something different about her, a quiet resistance that irritated him. He assigned her the worst duties, the most tedious tasks, and the longest shifts. When she completed them perfectly, he found fault in invisible details. When other soldiers made mistakes, he would publicly blame Sarah for not providing proper support or guidance. One particularly difficult morning, Sergeant Webb called Sarah into his office. The small room smelled of stale coffee and old paper. He sat behind his desk, fingers interlaced, wearing an expression that mixed authority with barely concealed contempt. He informed her that she would be placed on a performance improvement plan. According to him, her work had been consistently substandard, and if she did not show significant improvement within 30 days, he would recommend her discharge from the service. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but her face remained calm. She knew this was a lie. Her performance reviews from other officers had been excellent. Her technical skills were among the best in the unit. This was retaliation, pure and simple, because she had not broken under his constant pressure. She asked to see the specific performance issues in writing. Sergeant Webb's jaw tightened. He told her the documentation would be provided in due time and dismissed her with a wave of his hand. As Sarah left his office, she felt anger burning in her chest, but also a strange sense of clarity. This was the move she had been waiting for. By putting her on a false performance improvement plan, Sergeant Webb had made a critical mistake. He had created an official paper trail, one that could be challenged and exposed. He had finally overstepped in a way that could not be ignored. That afternoon, Sarah reached out to Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, a senior officer in the Human Resources Division, whom Jamie had mentioned as someone sympathetic to their cause. Sarah requested a private meeting, citing concerns about her career development. Rodriguez agreed, and they met 2 days later in a quiet corner of the base library. Sarah came prepared with copies of everything: her notebook, her performance evaluations from other officers, and testimonies from 3 other female soldiers who had experienced similar treatment from Sergeant Webb. She laid it all out on the table, her voice steady and professional. She explained that she was not seeking revenge or trying to destroy anyone's career. She simply wanted fair treatment and accountability. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. She had heard whispers about Sergeant Webb over the years, but no one had ever brought forward such comprehensive documentation. She explained to Sarah that the path ahead would not be easy. There would be investigations, interviews, and likely retaliation before things got better. Webb had friends in high places, and they would not give up their protection easily. Sarah nodded, understanding the risks. She asked Rodriguez what the proper procedure was for filing a formal complaint. Rodriguez outlined the steps, emphasizing the importance of following protocol exactly. Any deviation could be used to dismiss the complaint as invalid. She also warned Sarah that once the complaint was filed, there was no going back. The machinery would be set in motion, and Sarah would be at the center of a storm. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. She thought about her career, her dreams, and the possibility that this could all backfire terribly. But then she thought about the other women who had suffered in silence, the ones who had left the service broken and defeated. She thought about the future female soldiers who would serve under men like Webb if no one stood up to them. Her decision crystallized. She told Rodriguez she wanted to proceed with the formal complaint. They spent the next hour going through every piece of evidence, organizing it properly, and preparing the official documentation. Rodriguez praised Sarah's thoroughness and told her that this was one of the most well-documented cases she had ever seen. It would be hard to ignore or dismiss. That night, as Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, she felt a mix of fear and liberation. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Tomorrow she would submit the formal complaint through the proper channels. Sergeant Webb would be notified of the investigation within 48 hours. His world of unchallenged authority was about to crumble, and he did not even know it yet. Meanwhile, Sergeant Webb sat in his home, a modest house on the edge of town, drinking his evening whiskey and reviewing personnel files. He paused on Sarah Martinez's file, a slight smirk on his face. He believed he had successfully cornered her with the performance improvement plan. In his mind, she would either quit or comply, as so many others had done before her. It never occurred to him that she might fight back with weapons he had handed her himself. The next morning, Sarah walked into the base inspector general's office with her carefully prepared complaint. She handed it to the clerk with steady hands, signed all the necessary forms, and received her copy of the filing. As she left the office, the sun felt a little brighter, the air a little fresher. She had taken the first real step toward justice, and there was no turning back now. The investigation began quietly, as these things often do. Within 48 hours of Sarah's formal complaint, Sergeant Webb received official notification that he was under investigation for harassment and abuse of authority. The letter arrived in his office mailbox on a Thursday morning, delivered in a plain manila envelope marked confidential. When he opened it and read the contents, his face turned pale, then red with fury. For the first time in his 15-year career, someone had dared to formally challenge him. His first instinct was to find out who had filed the complaint. The letter did not name the complainant specifically, but Webb was not a fool. He knew it had to be Sarah Martinez. The timing aligned perfectly with his decision to place her on the performance improvement plan. What he could not understand was how a junior soldier had managed to build a case strong enough to trigger a formal investigation. Webb immediately called his old friend, Colonel Harrison, hoping to use their long relationship to make this problem disappear. But the colonel's response was disappointing. He explained that once a formal investigation was opened, he could not interfere without risking his own career. The Inspector General's office operated independently for this very reason. Webb would have to cooperate fully with investigators and hope that the allegations were not substantiated. The phone call ended with awkward silence, and Webb felt truly vulnerable for the first time in years. Meanwhile, Sarah continued her duties as if nothing had changed. She reported for her shifts, completed her assignments with the same excellence she always had, and maintained a professional demeanor. But word had spread through the unit like wildfire. Everyone knew an investigation was underway, though official policy prohibited discussing specifics. The female soldiers who had contributed to Sarah's case looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and concern, worried about potential backlash. The base investigator assigned to the case was Captain Michelle Torres, a no-nonsense officer with a reputation for thoroughness and fairness. She had conducted dozens of harassment investigations over her career and had seen every trick in the book. When she reviewed Sarah's complaint and supporting documentation, she was impressed by the level of detail and organization. This was not an emotional outburst or a personal vendetta. This was a carefully constructed case built on facts and corroboration. Captain Torres began conducting interviews with everyone involved. She spoke with Sarah first, asking detailed questions about specific incidents, timelines, and witnesses. Sarah answered every question calmly and precisely, referring to her notes when necessary. Torres appreciated the professionalism and clarity. She had interviewed many complainants who were too emotional or vague to provide useful testimony. Sarah was different. She was composed, credible, and consistent. Next came the witness interviews. Torres spoke with the 3 female soldiers who had provided written statements supporting Sarah's complaint. Each one described similar patterns of behavior from Sergeant Webb: excessive criticism, public humiliation, impossible standards, and a general atmosphere of hostility toward women. Their stories aligned with Sarah's account, creating a pattern that was difficult to dismiss as coincidence or misunderstanding. Torres also interviewed male soldiers in the unit, including some of Webb's supporters. Their testimonies were revealing in unexpected ways. While they defended Webb's character and leadership, they inadvertently confirmed the different treatment of male and female soldiers. They described how Webb was tough but fair with them, how he praised their work and offered mentorship. They did not seem to realize that their positive experiences actually highlighted the discriminatory nature of his treatment toward women. When Captain Torres finally interviewed Sergeant Webb himself, the contrast was stark. He sat across from her in the interview room, arms crossed defensively, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. He denied all allegations, claiming that Sarah was simply a poor performer who could not handle legitimate criticism. He insisted that any perceived harshness was standard military discipline applied equally to all soldiers regardless of gender. But when Torres pressed him for specific examples of Sarah's poor performance, his answers became vague and contradictory. He could not provide documentation to support his claims because none existed. His performance improvement plan for Sarah was based on subjective opinions rather than measurable failures. When Torres showed him Sarah's excellent performance reviews from other officers and her technical certifications, he dismissed them as not reflective of the standards he held in his unit. The interview lasted 2 hours, and by the end, Captain Torres had a clear picture. Sergeant Webb was a man who had operated without oversight for too long, who had created his own kingdom within the military structure, and who had never expected to be held accountable. His anger during the interview was not the righteous indignation of a falsely accused man. It was the fury of someone whose power was being questioned for the first time. As the investigation progressed, Webb's behavior at the base became increasingly erratic. He avoided eye contact with Sarah and other female soldiers. He spent more time in his office with the door closed. His normally perfect uniform became slightly disheveled, his boots less shiny. The other soldiers noticed the change and whispered among themselves. Some felt satisfaction seeing the mighty sergeant brought low. Others worried about what would happen if he was exonerated and sought revenge. Sarah, for her part, remained focused and steady. She knew that the investigation process could take weeks or even months. She continued documenting everything just in case. She also reached out to the other female soldiers, offering support and encouragement. She reminded them that they had done the right thing by speaking up, regardless of the outcome. Together they had broken the silence that had protected Webb for so long. One evening, as Sarah was leaving the communications building after a long shift, she ran into Sergeant Webb in the parking lot. It was unavoidable. They were the only two people there. For a moment they stood facing each other in the dim light of the overhead lamps. Webb's eyes were cold and calculating. He did not speak, but his expression conveyed everything: anger, contempt, and a promise of consequences. Sarah held his gaze without flinching. She did not look away or show fear. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, Webb turned and walked to his vehicle. As he drove away, Sarah released the breath she had been holding. She knew that this was far from over. The investigation might clear her name and hold Webb accountable, but the personal battle between them had reached a new level of intensity. The sergeant thought he still had the upper hand, but Sarah was about to prove him very wrong. The investigation took 6 weeks to complete, and during that time the atmosphere on the base became increasingly tense. Captain Torres worked methodically, interviewing more than 20 people, reviewing years of personnel files, and examining patterns of behavior that extended far beyond just Sarah's case. What she discovered painted a troubling picture of systemic problems within Sergeant Webb's unit. During the 4th week of the investigation, Torres uncovered something significant. 3 female soldiers had left the military early over the past 2 years, all of them from Webb's unit. Torres tracked them down and conducted phone interviews. 2 of them were willing to talk, and their stories were heartbreaking. Both described environments so hostile that they had developed anxiety and depression. They had left promising military careers because the daily psychological toll had become unbearable. Neither had filed formal complaints, fearing retaliation and believing the system would not protect them. These additional testimonies strengthened the case considerably. They established a clear pattern of behavior spanning years, not just isolated incidents. Webb's defense that he treated everyone equally became impossible to maintain. The evidence showed a consistent targeting of female soldiers under his command, while male soldiers thrived and advanced. Meanwhile, Sergeant Webb was becoming desperate. He sensed that the investigation was not going his way. He tried calling in favors from old military friends, but most were reluctant to get involved in an active investigation. He considered hiring a military defense attorney, but that would make him look guilty and drain his savings. He felt trapped, and his famous self-control began to crack in visible ways. One afternoon, Webb made a critical error. He approached Corporal Jamie Chen in the equipment room thinking they were alone. He told her that if she knew what was good for her career, she would reconsider any statements she had made to the investigator. His tone was threatening, his body language aggressive. What Webb did not know was that Jamie had started carrying a small audio recorder in her pocket, a decision she made after consulting with Sarah. The entire conversation was recorded. Jamie immediately reported the intimidation attempt to Captain Torres and provided the recording. Torres listened to it with growing concern. Witness intimidation was a serious offense that could result in additional charges and even criminal prosecution. Webb had just made the investigation much worse for himself. Torres officially added witness tampering to the list of allegations and scheduled another interview with Webb for the following day. When Webb received the summons for a second interview, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. He arrived at the interview room looking haggard, the confident swagger completely gone. Captain Torres played the recording for him without comment. As Webb listened to his own threatening words, the color drained from his face. He tried to explain that it was a misunderstanding, that he was just offering advice, but his explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. Torres asked him directly if he understood that intimidating witnesses in an active investigation was a serious crime. Webb nodded slowly, finally realizing the magnitude of his situation. He had gone from defending against harassment allegations to facing potential criminal charges. His military career, which had been his entire identity for 15 years, was collapsing around him. Back in Sarah's world, things were beginning to shift in unexpected ways. Other soldiers started treating her with more respect. Some approached her privately to thank her for having the courage to speak up. A few male soldiers apologized for not recognizing the problems earlier, or for not supporting their female colleagues when it mattered. The unit was changing, slowly but noticeably, as people confronted uncomfortable truths about their workplace culture. However, Sarah also faced negativity from some quarters. A small group of soldiers loyal to Webb spread rumors that she was causing trouble, that she could not handle military life, that she was weak and vindictive. These whispers hurt, but Sarah had developed a thick skin over the past months. She knew that significant change always met resistance, especially from those who benefited from the old system. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez checked in with Sarah regularly during this period, offering guidance and emotional support. She reminded Sarah that investigations of this magnitude often led to broader reforms and policy changes. What Sarah had started was bigger than just one complaint against one sergeant. It was exposing institutional weaknesses that needed to be addressed for the safety and well-being of all female service members. As Week 6 approached, Captain Torres completed her final report. It was comprehensive, devastating, and undeniable. The evidence showed clear and repeated violations of military harassment policies, abuse of authority, discriminatory treatment based on gender, and witness intimidation. Torres recommended immediate removal of Sergeant Webb from his position, formal reprimand in his permanent record, reduction in rank, and referral for possible criminal charges related to the intimidation incident. The report went up the chain of command, reaching the base commander's desk on a Monday morning. Colonel Patricia Anderson read through the entire document that afternoon, her expression growing grimmer with each page. She had been base commander for only 8 months and had prided herself on running a professional, respectful installation. The fact that this had been happening under her watch, in her command, made her both angry and determined to take decisive action. The following Wednesday, Sergeant Webb was summoned to the base commander's office. He knew what was coming. He had spent the previous days in a fog of anxiety and disbelief, barely eating or sleeping. When he stood before Colonel Anderson, she did not waste words. She informed him that the investigation had substantiated all major allegations. He was immediately relieved of his duties pending final administrative actions. He was ordered to surrender his office keys and security credentials. He was forbidden from contacting any witnesses or soldiers in his former unit. His military career was effectively over. Webb left the commander's office in a daze. As he walked across the base for what would be one of his last times in uniform, he saw soldiers going about their duties, living the military life he had always known. But he was no longer part of it. He had lost everything because he had believed himself untouchable, because he had underestimated a young soldier who refused to be broken. That evening, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez called Sarah to her office. She closed the door and told Sarah that the investigation had concluded in her favor. All allegations had been substantiated. Sergeant Webb had been removed from his position. Sarah sat quietly for a moment, processing the information. She felt relief, vindication, and exhaustion all at once. She had won, but the victory felt heavier than she had expected. Rodriguez told her that she should be proud. What she had accomplished required extraordinary courage and resilience. Because of her actions, the base command was implementing new training programs on harassment prevention, establishing better reporting mechanisms, and conducting climate assessments across all units. Real change was happening, and Sarah had been the catalyst. The sergeant thought he had the upper hand, but Sarah had escaped his control and left him facing the consequences of his own actions. The weeks following Sergeant Webb's removal brought a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty to the base. For Sarah and the other women who had testified, there was vindication but also vulnerability. They had won the battle, but they still had to live and work in an environment where some people resented them for exposing problems that others preferred to ignore. Sarah noticed the division among her fellow soldiers. Some treated her like a hero, someone who had stood up against injustice when others remained silent. They would nod respectfully when passing her in hallways, and a few even stopped to personally thank her for her courage. But others avoided her completely, viewing her as a troublemaker who had destroyed a decorated soldier's career over personality conflicts. The whispers continued in certain circles, painting her as vindictive and oversensitive. The base command moved quickly to address the institutional issues the investigation had revealed. Colonel Anderson mandated comprehensive harassment prevention training for all personnel. Not the standard check-the-box sessions everyone ignored, but meaningful workshops with real discussions about respect, accountability, and bystander intervention. She also established an anonymous reporting system and assigned multiple points of contact for harassment complaints, ensuring no single person could suppress allegations. Lieutenant Marcus Hayes was assigned as the interim leader of Sarah's unit, while a permanent replacement for Webb was selected. Hayes was younger, more progressive, and immediately set a different tone. His first meeting with the unit addressed the elephant in the room directly. He acknowledged what had happened, validated the courage of those who had spoken up, and made clear that under his leadership, all soldiers would be treated with equal respect and held to the same standards. His transparency was refreshing and helped begin the healing process. Meanwhile, Sergeant Webb faced the consequences of his actions. Within 2 weeks of his removal, formal administrative proceedings began. He was officially charged with multiple violations of military conduct regulations, including harassment, abuse of authority, and witness intimidation. His defense was weak because the evidence against him was overwhelming. His attorney advised him that fighting the charges would be futile and expensive, and that accepting responsibility might result in a more lenient outcome. Webb struggled with this advice. Accepting responsibility meant admitting he was wrong, and his pride made that nearly impossible. He had convinced himself for so long that his treatment of female soldiers was just tough leadership, that they were simply not cut out for military service. Acknowledging that he had been abusive and discriminatory required him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding. During this time, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Major Elizabeth Garrison, a senior officer from the regional command, requested a meeting. When Sarah arrived at the designated office, she found a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes and an air of authority earned through decades of service. Garrison explained that she had read the investigation report and Sarah's testimony, and she wanted to personally commend her courage. But Garrison had another purpose for the meeting. She told Sarah that the military needed leaders like her, people who would stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. She encouraged Sarah to consider attending leadership development programs and eventually pursuing officer candidacy. The military was changing, slowly but surely, and it needed strong voices to continue pushing that change forward. Sarah had already proven she possessed the moral courage that was essential for true leadership. The conversation deeply affected Sarah. She had been so focused on surviving day to day that she had not thought much about her long-term military future. She had joined to serve, but after everything that had happened, she questioned whether she wanted to stay in an institution that had allowed someone like Webb to thrive for so long. Yet Major Garrison's words planted a seed. Maybe the best way to honor what she and the other women had been through was not to leave, but to rise through the ranks and ensure the next generation of female soldiers had better experiences. Back in his small house, Webb received the final determination from the administrative board. He was found guilty on all charges. His punishment was severe: reduction in rank from sergeant to specialist, forfeiture of 2 months' pay, a formal letter of reprimand in his permanent file that would end any chance of future promotion, and strong recommendation for early separation from military service. He could appeal, but his attorney advised against it, saying the evidence was too strong and an appeal would only prolong the inevitable. Webb sat alone in his living room that night, staring at his uniform hanging in the closet. That uniform had defined him for 15 years. It had given him purpose, identity, and authority. Now it represented shame and failure. He thought about all the times he had belittled and humiliated female soldiers, convincing himself he was making them tougher, never recognizing the damage he was causing. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly see his actions from their perspective, and the weight of that realization was crushing. He thought about Sarah Martinez specifically. She was young, talented, and dedicated to service. Instead of mentoring and supporting her, he had tried to break her spirit. He had seen her potential as a threat to his authority, rather than an asset to the unit. And when she refused to be broken, when she fought back with intelligence and courage, he had underestimated her completely. She had outmaneuvered him at every turn, and his own arrogance had prevented him from seeing it until it was too late. The next morning, Webb made a decision. He would not appeal the administrative findings. He would accept his punishment and separate from military service quietly. Fighting would only prolong the pain for everyone involved, including himself. It was time to face reality. His military career was over, ended not by enemy action or honorable retirement, but by his own toxic behavior finally catching up with him. At the base, life continued to normalize under Lieutenant Hayes' leadership. The unit's performance actually improved as the hostile environment dissipated. Female soldiers who had been walking on eggshells began to relax and contribute more openly. Male soldiers who had unconsciously benefited from the old system started recognizing their female colleagues' skills and capabilities. The change was not perfect or complete, but it was real and meaningful. Sarah completed her shift one evening and walked out into the cool night air. She looked up at the stars, the same stars that soldiers throughout history had looked upon, and felt a sense of peace she had not experienced in months. She had faced her fear, stood up for herself and others, and emerged stronger. The sergeant had thought he had the upper hand, had believed his power and position made him untouchable. But Sarah had proven that truth and courage could overcome entrenched authority. She had escaped his shadow and left him to face the consequences of his choices. The victory was not just hers alone. It belonged to every woman who had suffered in silence, every person who had spoken up, and every future soldier who would benefit from a more just and respectful military culture. 6 months after the investigation concluded, the military base had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The changes went beyond policy updates and training sessions. Something fundamental had shifted in the culture, in how people treated each other, and in what was considered acceptable behavior from those in positions of power. Sarah Martinez stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her uniform. Today was significant. She had been promoted to sergeant herself, a recognition not just of her technical skills but of her leadership qualities and moral courage. The promotion ceremony would be held in the main assembly hall, and many of her fellow soldiers had told her they would be there to celebrate. It felt surreal to think that just half a year ago, she had been fighting just to be treated with basic respect. The ceremony was attended by more people than Sarah had expected. Colonel Anderson personally pinned the new rank insignia on Sarah's uniform, and in her brief speech, she spoke about the importance of integrity and courage in military service. She did not mention the investigation explicitly, but everyone understood the subtext. Sarah represented a new standard, a reminder that rank and authority came with responsibility and accountability. After the ceremony, Major Garrison approached Sarah with congratulations and an interesting proposal. The regional command was developing a new mentorship program, specifically designed to support and develop female military leaders. They wanted Sarah to be one of the founding participants and eventually a mentor herself to younger women entering the service. The program aimed to create networks of support and guidance that could help prevent the isolation and vulnerability that made situations like Webb's possible. Sarah accepted immediately. She understood now that her experience, as painful as it had given her unique insights that could help others. She could teach young women not just how to survive in the military, but how to thrive while maintaining their dignity and demanding respect. She could show them that speaking up against injustice was not career suicide, but an act of courage that the institution ultimately needed and valued. Meanwhile, in a small apartment 2 hours away from the base, Marcus Webb was trying to build a new life. He had been separated from military service 2 months earlier, leaving behind the only career he had ever known. The transition to civilian life was harder than he had imagined. Job applications required explanations for his military departure, and when potential employers learned about the circumstances, they lost interest quickly. No one wanted to hire someone with documented harassment and abuse of authority on their record. Webb had a lot of time alone to think about his choices and their consequences. The anger and denial that had sustained him initially had given way to something more uncomfortable: genuine remorse. He thought often about the women whose careers and mental health he had damaged. He remembered their faces, their names, the specific incidents where he had crossed lines he convinced himself did not exist. The memories were painful, but he forced himself not to look away anymore. One afternoon, Webb did something he never thought he would do. He attended a counseling session specializing in helping people recognize and change harmful behavioral patterns. The therapist asked him difficult questions about his views on women, authority, and respect. Webb struggled to answer honestly, but gradually began to understand how his upbringing, military culture, and personal insecurities had combined to create toxic attitudes he had never examined. The work was humbling and often uncomfortable, but it was necessary. Back at the base, the ripple effects of Sarah's courage continued to spread. 2 more soldiers in different units came forward with their own harassment complaints against other supervisors, citing Sarah's case as inspiration. The base command investigated these thoroughly as well, and in both cases found the allegations credible and took appropriate action. The message was becoming clear throughout the installation. Harassment and abuse would no longer be tolerated or swept under the rug. The culture of silence was breaking down. Jamie Chen, Sarah's friend who had also testified against Webb, received her own good news. She was selected for a competitive technical training program that would advance her career significantly. She credited Sarah with giving her the confidence to apply, saying that if Sarah could stand up to a powerful sergeant, she could certainly take risks in her professional development. The 2 women remained close friends, bonded by their shared experience and mutual support during the difficult times. Lieutenant Hayes, who had taken over the unit after Webb's removal, was promoted to captain and given permanent command. Under his leadership, the unit became one of the highest performing on the base. He credited the improved morale and collaboration to the more respectful and equitable environment. He often said in leadership meetings that treating people with dignity was not just morally right, it was operationally smart. Happy, respected soldiers performed better, stayed longer, and contributed more to mission success. 1 year after the investigation began, Sarah received an unexpected letter. It was from Marcus Webb. She stared at the envelope for several minutes before opening it, unsure what to expect. Inside was a handwritten note, not long but clearly carefully composed. Webb wrote that he had spent the past year in reflection and counseling, confronting the harm he had caused. He did not make excuses or ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged that his treatment of her and other female soldiers had been wrong, abusive, and inexcusable. He took full responsibility for his actions and their consequences. He wrote that he hoped she was thriving in her career and that the military was becoming the institution it should be. Sarah read the letter twice. She felt no obligation to respond, and part of her was skeptical about whether Webb's remorse was genuine or simply the result of facing consequences. But another part of her recognized that acknowledgement and accountability were important steps, even if they came late. She folded the letter and put it away, deciding she would think about whether to respond later. For now, she was focused on the future, not the past. The base continued to implement reforms inspired by the investigation. Annual climate surveys now included specific questions about harassment and discrimination. The chain of command was required to address negative trends immediately. Multiple reporting channels existed so that no single person could suppress complaints. Training programs emphasized active bystander intervention, teaching soldiers how to safely interrupt problematic behavior before it escalated. The changes were not perfect and problems still occurred, but the system was more responsive and accountable than before. Sarah threw herself into her new responsibilities with the same dedication she had always shown. As a sergeant herself now, she was mindful of how she exercised authority. She remembered what it felt like to be on the receiving end of arbitrary and cruel leadership. She made sure her soldiers knew they were valued, that their contributions mattered, and that they could come to her with concerns without fear of retaliation. She was firm when necessary, but always fair and respectful. The mentorship program Major Garrison had invited her to join proved incredibly rewarding. Sarah met young women entering military service with dreams and determination. Just as she had a few years earlier, she shared her story with them, not to frighten them, but to empower them. She taught them to document concerns, to know their rights, to support each other, and to never accept mistreatment as simply the price of service. She also taught them to be excellent at their jobs because competence combined with courage was a powerful force for change. 2 years after the investigation, Colonel Anderson retired from military service. At her retirement ceremony, she spoke about the accomplishments she was most proud of during her time as base commander. She mentioned several operational successes and training achievements, but she spent the longest time talking about the cultural transformation the base had undergone. She specifically mentioned Sarah Martinez by name, calling her an example of the kind of soldier and leader the military needed more of. Sarah, sitting in the audience in her dress uniform, felt tears in her eyes as fellow soldiers around her applauded. The story of what happened at the base spread through military channels, becoming something of a case study in leadership schools and ethics courses. Young officers learned about it as an example of how toxic leadership destroys unit cohesion and how courageous subordinates can drive necessary change. The narrative emphasized that rank and authority must be earned through character and competence, not simply asserted through intimidation and fear. Sarah often reflected on her journey from that first day when Sergeant Webb had tried to break her spirit to where she stood now. The experience had changed her in profound ways. She was stronger, more confident, and more committed to her values than ever before. She understood that justice sometimes required patience, strategy, and sacrifice. She had learned that systems could change when good people refused to accept the unacceptable. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes think about Sergeant Webb and wonder about his life now. She did not wish him continued suffering, but she also did not regret the actions that led to his downfall. He had made choices over many years, choices that harmed real people with real consequences. Accountability was not cruelty. It was necessary for healing and growth. She hoped he had genuinely learned from his mistakes, but that outcome was his responsibility, not hers. What Sarah knew with certainty was that she had done the right thing, even when it was terrifying and uncertain. She had refused to be another silent victim. She had gathered evidence, followed proper procedures, and stood firm when pressured to back down. Most importantly, she had not done it alone. Jamie, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Captain Torres, and the other women who had spoken up were all part of the victory. Systemic change required collective courage. As Sarah looked toward her future in the military, she saw opportunities she might not have imagined before. She was considering applying to officer candidate school, pursuing advanced technical certifications, and continuing her work with the mentorship program. Her career was thriving not in spite of what she had gone through, but in many ways because of it. She had proven her character under the most challenging circumstances possible. The sergeant had thought he had the upper hand. He had believed that his rank, his experience, and his connections made him untouchable. He had underestimated the young soldier standing in front of him, seeing weakness where there was actually steel. Sarah had escaped his control, exposed his misconduct, and left him to face the shame of his own actions. But more than that, she had helped create lasting change that would protect countless others who came after her. Standing on the base one evening, watching the sun set over the training fields, Sarah felt at peace. The journey had been difficult, the cost significant, but the outcome worthwhile. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. The military was not perfect, and challenges remained, but it was better than it had been. And Sarah Martinez, once a target of abuse and discrimination, had become a symbol of courage, integrity, and the power of standing up for what is right. Her story would be told for years to come, inspiring others to find their own courage when facing injustice. The sergeant thought he had won, but in the end, truth and courage had prevailed.